In the hills of Los Angeles, tucked away from the chaos of the city, stood the grand, ivy-covered estate once owned by legendary actor Charlton Heston, a place where he and his family spent decades in comfort. His home was as grand as the roles he played. Heston passed away in 2008, leaving behind a legacy marked by iconic performances in films like Ben-Hur, Planet of the Apes, and The Ten Commandments. His house, once a symbol of Hollywood glamour, now sat vacant, waiting for its next chapter. The new owners, Ryan and Elizabeth Harper, were not in the entertainment industry. They were a young couple in their early 30s, drawn to the house's architectural beauty and history. Ryan, a real estate agent, had always dreamed of owning a piece of Hollywood history, and when the house came on the market, it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. Elizabeth, a graphic designer, loved the idea of living in a place so rich with culture and stories of the past. First, the house seemed like a dream. The high ceilings, the sweeping staircases, the massive windows overlooking the city, it was everything they wanted. The walls, lined with portraits and artifacts, seemed to echo with the past. Yet the Harpers embraced it, believing it added to the charm. But soon things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, strange drafts in rooms that had no windows open, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and a persistent sense of being watched. At night, the house would groan with the sound of creaking floorboards, though no one was walking. The couple laughed it off, attributing it to the age of the house, but over time, the oddities became more persistent. One evening, Elizabeth was working late in the study, a room that had once been Heston's personal library. The dim light of her desk lamp cast long shadows across the walls. She thought she heard footsteps coming from the hallway, but when she checked, the corridor was empty. The sound continued, though growing closer, until she could hear it just outside the door. Her heart raced. The door was locked, and yet, the sound of heavy boots tapping on the floor remained. After a few moments, it stopped, and Elizabeth found herself standing frozen in place, unable to move. Ryan, too, began noticing the unsettling atmosphere. The house, despite its beauty, seemed to have a strange, oppressive energy. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, his mind racing with images of Heston's most famous characters, Moses, Judah, Ben-Hur, almost as though they were living in the walls, trapped in their own personal dramas. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him in the darkened corners of the house. One afternoon, the couple invited a few friends over for dinner. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to the house's history. One of their friends, a film enthusiast, mentioned that he had heard rumors that Heston's house was haunted. The actor, known for his intense devotion to his roles, was said to have become deeply connected to his characters in the years leading up to his death. Some speculated that the energy he invested into those roles might have lingered in the house, leaving behind an imprint that the new owners would inevitably encounter. That night, after their friends left, the couple found themselves wandering the halls in uneasy silence. As they passed the grand staircase, Elizabeth stopped and looked up. Standing at the top of the stairs, she saw the unmistakable figure of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence. His face was familiar, yet not fully clear, like a faded memory or an old photograph. For a moment, she froze, staring at the apparition, before it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Terrified, they called a medium to visit the house the next day. The medium, an older woman named Marie, walked through the rooms with a solemn expression, pausing at various points as if feeling the air shift. When she entered the library, her demeanor changed, and she stood still for several minutes, eyes closed, as though listening to something only she could hear. "I feel him here," she said softly. "Charlton Heston, yes. He never left. He is bound to this place, caught between the world of the living and the dead. He doesn't want to move on." Marie explained that Heston's intense emotional connection to his roles had somehow left an imprint on the house, and that his spirit was restless, unable to find peace. She suggested that the couple might be able to live with the energy in the house, but they would need to respect it, to acknowledge Heston's presence. Ryan and Elizabeth were skeptical at first, but they couldn't deny the strange occurrences that had intensified since they moved in. Eventually, they decided to accept the house's haunting as part of its charm. They began to leave offerings, small tokens of respect, an old film reel here, a vintage photograph there, hoping that this might appease whatever presence lingered in the house. Strangely, the house seemed to calm after that. The footsteps grew quieter, the whispers faded, and the cold drafts disappeared. But at night, when the couple walked through the darkened halls, they could still feel a presence watching them, a reminder that they were living in a place where the past and present were forever intertwined. They couldn't explain it, but they had learned to live with it, accepting that in the house of Charlton Heston, the past would never truly leave. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The longer the Harpers lived in the house, the more they began to understand the peculiar rhythms of its haunting. They adjusted at first to the small things, the unexpected chill in the study when the sun was setting, the faint sound of heavy footsteps crossing the floor when they were certain they were alone. The walls seemed to breathe with an unseen life of their own, as if the house itself was a living entity, keeping a pulse that only the keenest could feel. Even the air had a strange weight to it, thick, laden with memories that clung to every surface. The days blurred, and slowly, the house began to fold them into its strange and timeless embrace. One morning, Elizabeth was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as the first light of dawn filtered through the large, arched windows. The shadows still clung to the corners of the room, reluctant to give way to the new day. She was humming softly, the ritual of morning comfort starting to feel like her own, when she felt a familiar coldness sweep through the space. It wasn't as if the temperature dropped suddenly, but more like a shadow had crossed her path, settling over her skin like the touch of a forgotten hand. Her breath caught in her throat, and she paused, instinctively looking toward the doorway. Nothing was there. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had just walked by her, that she was being watched from the other side of the threshold. It wasn't a fleeting sensation, it clung to her, curling around her like smoke. She wasn't alone, not entirely. She glanced back at the doorway, but only the dim light and the silence of the house greeted her. "Ryan?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer. Ryan had started spending more time in the study lately, buried in real estate paperwork, a distracting and exhausting routine. He told Elizabeth he was getting used to the house's quirks, but Elizabeth knew better. The house had begun to change him. He was quieter now, more withdrawn, as though some part of him was slipping away. The weight of Charlton Heston's ghost was not something Ryan could so easily ignore. It pressed upon him in a way Elizabeth couldn't entirely understand. At night, she would wake to find him standing by the large window in their bedroom, staring out into the darkened hills, as though waiting for something or someone to appear. She had asked him what he was doing once, but his response was always vague, evasive, as if he wasn't quite sure what was drawing him there. A week later, Elizabeth ventured into the basement, a place she had avoided up until then. The staircase that led down to it was narrow and steep, the steps creaking with each step as though protesting her descent. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the earth of the house, the thick silence settling around her like a heavy cloak. There was an oppressive weight to the basement, a kind of suffocating stillness that made her want to turn around and run back upstairs. Yet something called her deeper into the shadows. She knew, of course, about the history of the house. Everyone did. The stories of Heston's life, his legacy, his work, these things were woven into the very fabric of the place. But there were whispers of something darker, too. The basement had always been off-limits to guests when Heston lived there. It was said that he kept personal memorabilia down there, letters, photographs, things from his past that were too precious to part with. But the real stories, those that weren't spoken aloud, suggested that something more sinister lingered in the basement, that it was a place of secrets. Elizabeth could feel it now, the pull of the unknown drawing her toward the farthest corner of the basement. She had never ventured this deep before. The bare bulbs hanging overhead flickered, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The cold stone floors were slick with moisture, and the faint smell of dust and mildew hung thick in the air. It was the smell of things forgotten, of time left to rot in the dark. At the back of the basement was a wooden door, narrow and unassuming, that Elizabeth had never noticed before. It was the kind of door that felt out of place in an otherwise well-maintained home. It seemed as though it had been forgotten, left behind in a corner that no one bothered to visit. It was locked. She ran her fingers along the edges, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath her touch, the grain worn from years of neglect. But there was something about it that compelled her to try. She had no idea why she felt so drawn to it, but there was no stopping herself. She searched through the pockets of her jacket for something, anything, to pry it open. The air around her seemed to tighten as if holding its breath, waiting for her to make the first move. When the door finally creaked open, the smell of old paper and decay flooded her senses. The room inside was small, with barely enough space for a chair and a desk cluttered with papers. Old photographs lined the walls, some faded, others curling at the edges as if too tired to hold onto their shape. The room looked like something out of another time, perhaps a forgotten study or a private space where Heston had retreated to think, to write. But there was a strange unease in the air, a palpable heaviness that seemed to hang over everything, weighing down the walls, the desk, even the floorboards beneath her feet. On the desk, tucked into a wooden box, Elizabeth found a small bundle of letters. The paper was old and yellowed, the ink faint and smeared in places, as though time had worn away the very words. They were addressed to someone named M, and contained fragments of conversations, thoughts, musings on life and death, memories of things long past. As she carefully unraveled the bundle, one letter slipped from her fingers and fell to the ground, its contents catching her eye. The handwriting was familiar Heston's, but it was not a letter of gratitude or fanfare. It was dark, desperate, a plea. "I feel him," the letter began. "In the walls, in the air. There are things in this house that I cannot explain. I've tried to leave, but it calls me back. It watches me, always. I hear it in the night, the sound of footsteps, heavy boots on the floor. It is as though the man I once was is no longer here. I don't know how much longer I can remain." Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as the room seemed to close in on her. The weight of Charlton Heston's presence had never been more real, more suffocating. She wasn't sure whether to leave the letters behind or to take them to Ryan, but something in her gut told her that the house was no longer just a home, it was a prison. And they were its prisoners, trapped in a cycle that had long outlasted the man who had once lived there. She quickly stuffed the letters back into the box, but as she moved toward the door, a sudden coldness swept through the basement, and the unmistakable sound of heavy boots echoed through the room. It was no longer a question of whether the house was haunted, it was a matter of how long they could continue to live with the past, before it swallowed them whole. As Elizabeth hurried back up the narrow staircase, the air around her seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her chest with every step. The coldness from the basement had followed her, lingering at the edges of her mind, clawing at her thoughts. She could feel it, the weight of something ancient and oppressive, as though the house itself was alive, and it knew what she had uncovered. The darkness in the basement had followed her upstairs, creeping along the walls like a shadow too persistent to ignore. When she reached the main floor, she found Ryan standing in the living room, staring out of the large windows toward the distant hills. His posture was stiff, his face pale. He looked as though he hadn't noticed her approach, lost in whatever thoughts haunted him. He had been like this for weeks, and Elizabeth could never quite shake the feeling that he was slipping further away from her, from the life they had built together. "Ryan?" she called softly, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't fully place. Fear, perhaps, or something deeper. The house, the letters, everything felt like a storm, gathering strength. He turned slowly, as if her voice had startled him out of a trance. His eyes were distant, unfocused, and for a moment, Elizabeth didn't recognize the man standing before her. He looked like her husband, but there was something behind his eyes, something cold, almost vacant, that made him appear as though he were no longer entirely there. "I saw it again," he said, his voice low and ragged. There was no need to ask what he meant. Elizabeth knew instantly. It was the presence, the thing that had been following them both, growing stronger by the day. Ryan had seen it, too, the shadow, the figure that seemed to linger just beyond their vision, always watching. "The man in the hallway?" Elizabeth asked, her breath catching in her throat. Ryan nodded slowly, but his expression was distant, as though he wasn't fully present in the moment. "I saw him last night, just standing at the top of the stairs. He was so still, so quiet. Couldn't breathe. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I don't know what it was. It wasn't him. It wasn't just a memory of Charlton Heston. It was something else." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. The things they had experienced were no longer just strange occurrences, they were becoming tangible, undeniable. The house wasn't merely haunted by the echoes of the past. It was suffocating them, pulling them deeper into its twisted history. "I found something," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached into the pocket of her jacket, pulling out the bundle of letters she had found in the basement. Ryan's gaze shifted to the bundle, and something flickered in his eyes, a spark of recognition, or perhaps fear. "What is it?" he asked, his voice strained. "They're letters from Heston," she replied, her voice trembling. "He wrote them in the last years of his life. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it too." Ryan took the letters from her, his hands trembling as he unfolded the yellowed pages. His eyes scanned the faded ink, his brow furrowing as he read the words Elizabeth had seen earlier. He didn't speak at first, only reading in silence, as though the words were pressing against him, pushing him into some dark place. Finally, after a long moment, he spoke. This isn't just about Heston. This is about us." His voice was strained, raw with emotion. He felt it here in this house, the darkness, the presence. He paused, his words hanging in the air like a bitter truth. "It's not letting us go. It's pulling us in." Elizabeth's heart raced as she took a step back. The thing in the house had never been satisfied with just Heston. It had chosen them too, chosen to tether them to its history, to its restless spirit. It wasn't just an actor's legacy that haunted these halls. It was something darker, something that had been waiting for years, for the right moment to rise again. Ryan looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with the same realization that had gripped her. "We need to leave," he whispered. "We have to get out of here, Elizabeth, before it's too late." But even as he spoke, a sudden coldness filled the room, sweeping over them like a physical force. The temperature dropped, and the shadows around them seemed to stretch, grow longer, as if the walls themselves were shifting, closing in. The air grew thick with an unnatural presence, a palpable heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The house was alive, and it was no longer content to watch from the corners. A sound echoed from upstairs, slow, deliberate steps, heavy boots crossing the floor. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. Elizabeth froze, her heart pounding as the unmistakable weight of something or someone moved closer. The steps grew louder, closer, until they were just outside the door, filling the silence with their insistent rhythm. Elizabeth's hands shook as she reached for Ryan, her fingers brushing his arm in a futile attempt to pull him away. But Ryan stood rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the doorway as if he couldn't look away, as if the house had taken hold of him completely. "It's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a tremor of recognition in his tone. "He's here." The door to the living room creaked open, and in the dim light, Elizabeth saw a figure standing in the threshold, a tall man, broad-shouldered, his silhouette stark against the darkened hallway. The face was obscured, but the presence was undeniable. This wasn't Heston. Couldn't be. This was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air grew heavier with every passing second, the pressure in the room building to a suffocating intensity. Elizabeth's heart raced, and she could feel the pull of the presence in her chest, tugging at her, pulling her toward it, toward whatever fate it had in store for them. Ryan stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the figure as if drawn to it by some invisible force. Elizabeth wanted to scream, to shout, to pull him back, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The figure moved, slowly, deliberately, its presence growing stronger with each step, as though the very walls of the house were closing in around them. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan stood motionless, staring at the spot where the figure had been, his face pale and vacant, as though he were no longer fully present in the world. Elizabeth's legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor, her breath coming in short gasps. She couldn't understand, it couldn't explain what had just happened. Had it been a hallucination? A trick of the mind? But deep down, she knew it wasn't. It was real. The house had claimed them, as it had claimed Charlton Heston. The darkness had found them, and now there was no escape. They were part of its history, bound to its walls, forever caught between the past and the present. And in that moment, Elizabeth understood. There would be no leaving. The house would never let them go. Not now. Not ever. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.